Hello and welcome back, this is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Farm Tycoon game, and what we're going to be looking at is kind of the things I've worked on throughout the week to 2 weeks since I've last recorded, and I'm going to show you kind of what we've done. So the first thing you're going to notice immediately is that the lighting has changed. I've now added 2D lighting. Let's just play here and I can quickly show it. So I've added now a 2D lighting which is experimental for the 2020 Unity version, and it just allows me to cast shadows on sprites in a little bit of a better fashion than something like I did in Turtle Trial or other 2D games, where you have to kind of artificially create that 2D lighting effect. Now there actually is 2D lighting, similar to how it's done in 3D space, using very similar things. So this global light is basically a directional light for 2D. We have lots of other things like freeform, sprite, point, parametric, and so what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be using this lighting to kind of play around with making the scene look even better and making the game look a lot better, which is ultimately what I want to do, is maybe add a day and night cycle and have it so that in the dungeons the lighting is a little bit more makes the dungeon a little bit more interesting and stand out, rather than just it being a basic 2D plane with basic lighting. So that's the big thing that's changed with this, with the visuals aspect, things like UI and stuff I'm going to go over now. But before I do that, let's look at all the overworld stuff, so everything that's been changed on this map before we dive into the dungeon. So the overworld. So right now, previously in the previous videos, I mentioned that the adventurers should go invisible when they reach a certain building, and they weren't going invisible. They now are. You can still see the torches that they have, and these torches will be disabled during the daytime, but at nighttime they will be enabled. I haven't coded that in yet, but it will be the case. You can see we've got a little bit of light on our selection point, which is now a lot smaller. Villagers will go invisible when they go to buildings. My selection point is smaller, a little bit more accurate with collision and with the detail UI. So if I were to click on a villager, you will actually be able to see the detail UI a little bit better. And what we're going to do is you're actually going to see me kind of be able to click on the details, and we'll talk about this little aspect here, this dungeon 1, in a minute, this UI. But I'm just waiting for a villager right now. You can also see the with the new 2D lighting, we can also cast shadows, which are using the 2D experimental shadow caster. I'll go over that in a minute as well. Okay, so here we go, we got a dragonkin, and what you'll notice immediately is while the UI has changed, so a lot of the settings haven't changed too much. It's specifically the name generation and the role generation. So now the names and all of that, we now have a bunch of different NPCs which you can see with their own sprites and animation, their own moving animation, and this is also accompanied with the fact that when you click on them they have a unique name and a gender and a specific race, so or specific role, should I say. So if we could click on, let's say this knight, at the moment it's Brad and it's male knight, and this will also kind of just adds a little bit more to the scene and the environment, as we've got different kind of adventurers joining into the island, getting ready to go to a dungeon. So we got here, which is a female villager. It's also important to mention that the names are completely randomized, and I've set out the names in the code, and it just chooses at complete random what gender they are and what name it is. So the next thing obviously is that when I click on an NPC, you can now, it's a lot more accurate. So at the moment they aren't going invisible here, and that's because I kind of wanted them to have a queue. Look like a queue, but it's kind of glitching out, so I might just make it so that they do go invisible. Next is the random rotation script has now been fixed. So before, all of these objects, these trees, these flowers, these rocks, they did have a random rotation on them, and which flips them the sprite. However, it wasn't working correctly, so I fixed it. So now some of the flowers are randomly placed, randomly facing left or right. Same with the trees and the hay and different things and the rocks. And this just adds a little bit to the scene as well. The next thing to mention is that up here we have a pause, normal, fast and very. These are our speed utility tools so that we can basically speed up time, slow time and pause the game, and this is going to be very handy for any time that you want to just wait and kind of, if you're bored or you've got nothing to do, you know, it's just to keep the game moving and keep the player interested. So what you can see here is I've sped up the game just so we can earn more gold quickly while I talk about the building upgrade system. So the building is can now be upgraded based on what it is. So if I were to place down a random house or building or water, they will have different effects based on what they do. And if I click on, let's say, the weapons, it'll bring up a UI, it will close down the adventurer UI, bring up the building UI, and then you can see the title of the building, so weapon style, and you can see all the different stats. So right now you can see the current level, which is 0 out of 3 because we haven't upgraded. We've also got the a description, we've also got the current effects, and the next effect after you've upgraded. You can also see how much the upgrade is going to cost, which is quite nice, and at the moment the upgrade doesn't do anything, it's just there, but basically it is ready to be coded, and I'll probably be doing that next as well. You can also close it down as well, and that's just a little bit of an extra thing, just to be able to close it off. So with that, that's most of the things done for the overworld. Obviously, as I mentioned a minute ago, the UI has changed. There will be a link in the description to the UI I've used. And now we get into the really big things, which is the dungeon aspect. So the dungeon is where most of my time has been spent working on. A lot of changes have happened, and now that we're earning quite a lot of gold, I can just go in and have a look. So once you click on that cave, then this UI will pop up, and obviously it's not coded yet, so that's why it was on the right in the beginning. And what you can do is you can go and create a dungeon. Now when you go into create dungeon, it'll automatically start you off with an entrance section as well as a player. Again, I think you'll be able to customize a player if you want, but it'll start you off with this, just a basic entrance room. These green boxes will allow you to know where the connection points are, and I'll go over them in a second. But what's really important is that you can actually see a grid, and this won't be available, or shouldn't be available, when you actually play as the player, because yes, you will be able to run around in this dungeon that you've created. In the previous video I mentioned that you could not build on the specific rooms and that you had to be a certain distance already. However, the placement on the grid was actually broken, and so I just want to show that that is now fixed. So now you can place items exactly where you expect them to be able to be placed. So they completely correlate with the position on the grid. It's very easy to connect them up now, and shouldn't be too much of an issue. The way I've done this actually is completely different to how I've set this out, because there was another issue which I showed in the previous video, which is if I had the way I was showing the buildings in the world on this specific grid was that I was showing an image that I'd basically edited out in a different program, brought it in, and that would be just an image as an icon, basically a sprite. I've changed it now, so now instead of a sprite we're actually using a prefab of the building itself that we're moving, so it's completely different. Instead of a sprite, it's a prefab, which is a little bit more taxing, I suppose, but it means I get perfect accuracy and perfect size variation, so I think that's perfect. Obviously we have our lighting, which the player is currently producing quite a big amount of light. However, we have a different variation of shadow occurring here. So the light is currently, let's just get rid of that second. The light is currently being pushed against our boxes here, which if you've seen the Shadowcaster in other videos or anyone's videos, you'll know that it basically works the same way as a poly collision for 2D, where you can just create it and you can place it wherever you want, but you can determine if it has a self shadow and if it doesn't, and if it has silhouette. So, and that's why this section looks darker than the top section, and you'll see that in a minute when we actually adventure. So enough talking, let's actually build out a dungeon. Okay, so we have a dungeon, and this is kind of what I'm going to go with, and this is what we've got so far. So now what we're going to do is we're going to, now that we've actually finished our dungeon, and let's say we've finished editing it completely, this is what we want. We can always go back and edit it later, but if this is what we want, what's going to happen is we can click exit dungeon. Now, when we exit dungeon, this is when these green boxes will actually do something. So what these green boxes are doing is detecting if there is an open section of the dungeon. So these are basically what I call locks, and gate locks. So what we're going to do is, just before we do anything, let's go and show you what they are. So inside these prefabs, which is our rooms, we have these lock areas, which will determine what door will be locked. So in the prefabs themselves, let's just go into maybe, oh, I can't do that while we're doing that. But what we can do is we can go into, let's say, this prefab, and we can have a look at these different sections, and we can see that we got a blue, you can see that we got a green square all the way around the open sections of this room, and depending on what part of the prefab it is will determine what door will appear. And all this is just a detection, a collider which will detect another collider with a script, and it will determine if it spawns something like a wall. Very, very simple. And here it is, here's the script, so spawn lock wall, and depending on what number it is, so I can just assign what number it is, and that will determine what where the door will appear, or what type of door will appear, and I do that based on where these positions are. And if it collides with a dungeon room, then it will lock. It will not lock the that room, that section. It will not spawn a prefab of one of these locked rooms. Instead, what will happen is that it won't, and if there is nothing, if it's not colliding with anything, then what will happen is it will spawn one of the associated prefabs with its number. So to show that off, obviously what we're going to do is we're going to press play. Now let's go back into here. So to show that off, what we're actually going to do is press play, and obviously we're still in. So all we have to do is exit dungeon, and it will complete. So you see that in a minute these will lock. So let's click that, and we're back to the overworld. So now we can actually enter and play in that dungeon. But before I do that, I can just show you in this area what it actually looks like. Now this room here isn't actually done. It won't lock because I've not finished it yet. However, these sections have locked. So as you can see, we've got a wall here, we've got a wall here, wall here, a wall here, because these were all open sections. But these parts have actually hit something, so they're not spawning anything. So these are places that player can actually travel. So let's try that out. So let's start adventure. And so we're inside the dungeon. Now you'll really see the lighting effect, and you'll really see how it looks. And obviously it's a little bit, I've not finished it yet, so the lighting on the shadows is a bit harsh, and it's kind of not complete yet. But as you can see, what's happening is we can travel through the dungeon, and the lighting isn't finished, but you can see what is actually happening here. Now you can see there is a little bit of obviously glitchiness, for example here, where the shadow is in between a wall. This is partly because the shadow box isn't over enough, and so there's still a gap, a very tiny gap, and so it's creating that little bit of line. But for the most part that is done, and obviously what you've got here is the walls that I mentioned that are blocking you off. Now we can still travel, of course, across the dungeon. So we're in here, still a wall, and we can travel down. So of course the previous bug was that the collisions weren't working through the rooms, and that is now fixed. I have, as you can see, I've added decoration to these prefabs, so the flooring and the flags and different, and like the lava over here, the lava little fountains. I've added a little bit of decoration to these rooms, as well as we got torches for some of the lighting. And this is just to add a little bit more to the rooms. we can also delete and destroy certain rooms now. So before we couldn't delete these rooms, now we can. So if I quickly exit adventure, oh, and it's still dark, don't worry about that, and then we go into create/edit, we can edit the actual rooms again. So we can actually destroy these locks, which we're going to have to. And what we'll do is, let's say we delete this. So there we go, we can now delete specific rooms. We can go all the way back and we can get some money, or we can leave certain sections still around. So we do have a lot more code now going on, and it's been a while since I've shown the code, so at the moment we do have a lot of, I'd say the last time I showed the code is, I'd say we doubled on terms of how much code we have now. So the placement's a little bit more advanced. We got the spawn locks code, as well as a dungeon manager for what controls the buttons at the top right and what dungeon this actually is going to spawn, so we don't get multiple dungeons or the same dungeon. We could also, obviously, we got to determine how close the dungeon objects are in the starts and things like that. So I believe that is everything that I wanted to show today. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.